Hi, my name is Alex LaRose, and today I'm addressing the social problem and issue of discrimination, intergenerational trauma, and its effects on Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Some background information on myself is that I am in my first semester of child and youth care, and I'm very interested in advocating for a variety of social problems. So, whether it be through protests, social media, or just in like volunteer work or normal conversation, I enjoy learning about different social issues and bringing awareness to them. I believe that many social issues are researched in depth, but the solution to them is often unclear and just not explored enough. So, for example, we know that the roots of global warming and the steps that we need to take to minimize the amount of pressure it puts on our Earth. However, not many people are actually willing to put in the work and take these steps in order to actively participate in these solutions. So the social problem that I chose to speak about is addressing the discrimination, intergenerational trauma, and its effects on Indigenous peoples in Canada. In other words, I'm just going to be addressing issues that face the Indigenous community in Canada due to their past and present oppression and trauma. In our textbook, a social problem is defined as a social condition that a segment of society views as harmful to members of society and in need of remedy. I believe that this topic fits the textbook definition perfectly. I know that it may seem like a questionable topic for someone who's non-Indigenous to choose. However, I do have quite a few reasons why I did choose this topic. So the first one being that in grade 11, my English course was transformed from the traditional Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe readings into knowledge on the historical context of the assimilation and the oppression of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I learned about residential schools, truth and reconciliation, and we read only pieces of writing that were written by Indigenous authors or writing that accurately represented the past of Indigenous peoples in Canada and America, so North America. I have never learned about these issues in depth from school until grade 11, and I was very surprised that we never had touched on the subject in this way. Learning what I did was really intriguing to me, and I felt like we should have learned it a long time ago. It was very interesting. Why I chose this issue is because I have family and friends who are part of the Indigenous community or who grew up on Native reserves, and I feel that it's kind of my moral obligation to bring awareness to this type of issue that's so close to their hearts. So my mom and her brother were adopted from different families, so I don't actually have Indigenous blood. However, my uncle was born Indigenous and was put up for adoption. He was adopted by my grandparents, and so he missed out on being raised on a reserve in his native roots. So he doesn't really connect to that side of him, but he is still Indigenous. I also have two Indigenous cousins from my Uncle Joe, one of them being my cousin Christian, who has a girlfriend named Jacine, who is also Indigenous. Jacine was born and raised on Walpole Island, an Indigenous reserve in Ontario. She's very tied to her traditions and practices, and she's always educating myself and others on the importance of understanding Indigenous culture and struggles. Christian and Jacine also have a baby daughter. Her name's Clara, who is also Indigenous. I have many Indigenous peoples in my life, and because of them, I've had opportunities to visit Manitoulin Island, Walpole Island, and Moravian Town, which are just a few native reserves in Ontario. I loved observing the arts and the traditions that they practice on their land, and I find it very beautiful and admirable. And so the main issue is that in the past, over many years, Indigenous people have had their land stolen by European settlers and have been murdered and discriminated against for no cause whatsoever. In the late 1400s, when Christopher Columbus first discovered the land that was already occupied by Indigenous peoples, the European colonizers seized their land and enslaved the natives. Ever since this day, Indigenous peoples have been discriminated against and forced into Eurocentric views and beliefs and into a lifestyle that they are not born to live. The incidence of natives being given smallpox-infected blankets by the Europeans the 60s scoop, where Indigenous children were taken from their homes and forced into non-Indigenous foster homes or adoption centers, and the residential school system of Canada, which continued up until 1996, are all prime examples of the trauma Indigenous peoples in Canada have had to face since the 1400s. These are just a few examples displaying a small portion of the hundreds of years of trauma and discrimination. The major things I would like to focus on is that it was the Canadian government as a whole who decided to pass the Indian Act and open residential schools where Indigenous children were forced into the white man's mannerisms and basically the white man's world. They were meant to change everything about themselves to become more European and more white. To cover the entire history and background of Indigenous struggles would honestly take me hours, maybe even days. But since I have given enough background to promote a general understanding of these struggles that they have to face, I'm going to explain how this impacts Indigenous peoples in our communities today. Despite living in Canada, which is considered to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, Indigenous peoples face poverty, inadequate housing or homelessness, food security, unsafe drinking water, and less access to health and education services. All of these things obviously aren't good for anyone to have to deal with, but considering that Indigenous people deal with these issues due to Canada's past, it seems unfair that we as a country would not do more to support Native peoples. That's a personal opinion of mine. I just feel like if we are supposed to be working towards truth and reconciliation, why not start with the major things like this? Poor health and living conditions. Many natives suffer from intergenerational trauma brought on specifically by residential schools. So when it's made very clear as an Indigenous person today that you're still not treated as a complete equal to some others, I can understand how it would make it hard to overcome these past traumas and heal from them when you're still dealing with it in your everyday life. I spoke to my cousin-in-law, Jacine, and asked her if there was any topic she felt specifically needed to be addressed and discussed, and she brought up residential schools. So she feels that many people are uneducated about the actual tragedies of the residential school system, and people fail to realize how historically close we are to those times. So many people assume that residential schools are a thing of a distant past, when in reality, the last one closed just under 25 years ago in 1996. In her own words, she said, "One aspect I think is important to know is that many Indigenous peoples today in Canada are only 1 or 2 generations away from residential schools. So for example, I was raised by my dad, and my dad was raised by a residential school survivor. I just think it's important for people to know that, because so many people think that it was so long ago when really we are all still healing." So this has an impact on Indigenous peoples regarding their health and well-being, but also in many other ways. For example, Indigenous communities have been evicted or forced to leave due to government ordeals regarding mining, logging, and new developments. The government has also physically removed or stripped away many Indigenous communities of their natural resources for business interests or economical reasoning. In Native culture, they rely on the land for much of their cultural and spiritual practices and are very involved with nature. Not only does this process impoverish the land on which they depend on for sustenance, it also destroys sacred sites and upsets the ecological balance that forms the foundation of these cultures. Along with what I previously mentioned, due to assimilation brought on by the government and residential schools, Indigenous peoples experienced a loss of their native language, traditions, cultures, beliefs, and spiritual practices. So for many years, certain natives were not even permitted to speak their own language or practice their beliefs, which led to a mass extinction of Indigenous culture. Many Indigenous people today feel as if they have a piece of them missing, due to their lack of knowledge in their own languages. Together a list of surprising statistics that I felt accurately displayed the negative effects and impact that Canada's actions has had on Indigenous peoples and their culture today. So the first one being that living conditions on Canadian Indian reserves are at the same level as those in a country with a ranking of 78 on the UNDP Human Development Index. To put this into perspective, Canada ranks as a number 6. So this means that even though our country as a whole is among the highest, these individuals that are living outside of our communities, just outside of our communities, are living an exponentially poorer and less fortunate lifestyle. Another statistic is 2 centuries ago, Indigenous people lived in most of the Earth's ecosystems. Today, they have the legal right to use only about 6% of the planet's land, and in many cases, their rights are partial or qualified. Another statistic would be that 33.6% of those who identified as an Aboriginal person have no high school or equivalency certificate, compared to 18.3% of the rest of the Canadian population. Regarding this last statistic, employment rates for Indigenous peoples are already lower than non-Indigenous people, and adding the lack of education is not going to make it any easier for them to find work. So that puts that into perspective. And the last statistic that I have here is that suicide rates are 5 to 7 times higher for First Nations youth than for non-Aboriginal youth. And for Inuit youth, which is another strand of Indigenous, the rate is among the highest in the world, 11 times the national average. These problems are clear indications that there are people, our neighbors even, who struggle with issues related to the oppression of Indigenous peoples every day. Some people will not see the objective in putting energy into this topic. However, due to Canada's past actions against the group of people, as a Canadian, you should feel obligated and proud to support the Indigenous community in whatever way you possibly can. So I've learned from our textbook that almost every social problem has more than just one solution. Starting with the solutions and steps that have already been taken in an attempt to mend these relationships, we have quite a few. One being that a formal apology has been put out by the Prime Minister, and the Government of Canada has released a document called Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Calls to Action. This 20-page document outlines hundreds of calls to action that the government and Canadian communities are obligated to take in order to reconcile and reveal the truth of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. Another solution that has been presented is that in many schools, public or private offices and organizations, Indigenous counseling is offered. So this consists of support, counseling, and therapy directly specified towards Indigenous people. This allows for their specific traumas and issues to be addressed in a safe environment, which is free of solution or aid is that there are hundreds of groups and organizations that have formed to raise awareness, fundraise, or offer supports to Indigenous peoples and their communities. Some of these include Spirit North, Building Assets, and Native Addiction Services. These groups are formed all across Canada, and it is more likely that there will be at least one Indigenous fundraising community or organization in whatever your area you are. So a next step that we can take is practicing not appropriating Indigenous culture, practice, or beliefs, and instead respecting these and raising awareness about their past and present. Another very simple solution is to reach out to Indigenous people in your community and be open to learning more about their way of life. You can ask them questions and learn to appreciate their culture. It is very fulfilling and very beautiful. A next step for the government to be taking would be to increase the funding for Native reserves or Indigenous communities and ensure more job security and healthcare access. By making these resources more accessible and providing more information, it will improve many people's living situation. And adopting a more inclusive, flexible learning system specifically for Indigenous children could also be a future solution to working on the education barrier.